Hey everybody, Mr. Moppin coming at you. This is the third video for AP Gov's topic 2.12, taking a look at the bureaucracy. Previously, we did a little overview of the federal bureaucracy in terms of its structure, and then we started to take a look at issue networks and iron triangles. Today, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at a little bit of the history of the job awarding process for federal bureaucrats. And it has gone through quite an evolution along the way. When we first started to see federal bureaucrats being hired, of course, the president would pick those positions. And for the first generation or so of the Republic under the Constitution, generally the sentiment was for bureaucrats, once they were chosen, assuming they were still competent, that they would be able to keep their jobs regardless of who was the president of the United States. Now, I'm talking about, kind of lower level bureaucrats. So I'm talking about, tax collectors, for example, people working at the Postal Service, that kind of stuff. So anyhow, the first generation or so was, once you got appointed and you got, approved for a federal job, you got to keep the job no matter who was president, as long as you were fairly competent. But that's going to be changing in the 1830s with this guy right here, good old Andrew Jackson. Now, we've talked about how Andrew Jackson was not afraid to break traditions as president. For example, using way more vetoes than any previous presidents, a willingness to use his kitchen cabinets as opposed to his formal cabinet for his chief advisors. But maybe his most significant non-traditional way of being president is going to be his usage of awarding federal jobs. Jackson is going to be coming from the military. And for a lot of folks in the military, the officer corps, etc., especially a general like Jackson, personal relationships are essential. And that personal relationship from a subordinate to a superior officer, from Jackson's perspective, had to be based on loyalty, that you were to be loyal to your superior officer. Now, when it comes to politics, loyalty is a little bit harder to come by. And so for Jackson, inheriting previous bureaucrats from a previous administration, in this case it was John Quincy Adams' administration, Jackson just simply did not trust these folks. It's not a matter of competency, but personal trust. So how do you know which people to trust? Well, you're going to look at things like, who are your friends, perhaps family members, at a minimum, people that clearly played a role in helping you get elected, basically party loyalists. So what Jackson is going to start to do is basically hand out these jobs as if they were spoils from war. That's where the term the spoil system comes from. Way back in ancient times, like a Roman conqueror would go into a territory, conquer it, and then dole out the jewels and the gold and the land, whatever, to his loyal troops. Well, as president, you don't quite have, land and jewels to, toss out to your loyal party supporters, but you do have something very valuable, federal jobs. And so that's what's going to be kind of done, is that if you have been loyal, if you have helped to get the president get elected, you will be rewarded with some type of federal job. Now, this is going to be good for Jackson and maybe other presidents because they get their people in positions that they want. But it's not necessarily going to be the best for the federal government as a whole, because what we will very quickly find through this spoil system process that starts with Jackson and continues on throughout most of the rest of the 19th century, is that it tends to, kind of encourage corrupt and incompetent people for a lot of these jobs. That, loyalty does not necessarily correlate to honesty in terms of not taking bribes, not lining your pockets with, fringe benefits from your job. So that's going to be problematic. And unfortunately, this spoil system will really start to get very abusive, to the point that by the time we get to the post-Civil War era, there's going to be just an understanding that every 4 to 8 years, usually at this point every 4 years, a new president's going to come to D.C., everybody in the federal government, everybody in the federal bureaucracy is going to get canned, and then there's going to be brand new people brought in, and there's just going to be an assumption that to some degree these federal bureaucrats will take bribes, they will skim money off the top, but that's just the way business is done. The awarding of these jobs is called patronage, so I did want to make sure that you were aware of that concept, just kind of rewarding your loyal subordinates with these federal jobs. But it came to be kind of associated with, you get a federal job because you're simply loyal to the president, and there's an understanding that you're going to probably be corrupt to some degree or another. Now, like I said, this is going to be continuing on for most of the rest of the 19th century, and it just gets, more and more pervasive in terms of the corruption and things like that. It finally comes to a head in 1881 with President Garfield. Now, James Garfield was, your typical president at that time. He comes to office, everybody in the federal bureaucracy is fired, and he goes through the process of trying to, go through all the paperwork and all the applications for people wanting federal jobs. In fact, back in the 19th century, during this spoil system era, what you would see happen is people traveled to D.C. with, letters of introduction in hand, what we would consider to be 19th century version of resumes and stuff like that, and would literally go to the White House and knock on the door of the White House. You could do that back then, and you would be received by, somebody working there, and they would take your application, and, there would be lines of people looking to get interviews and stuff like that. It was pretty chaotic, and it helped lead to D.C. being pretty transient in those days. Well, how does this relate to Garfield in particular? Well, one of these job seekers was a guy named Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau claimed that he had done a lot of work for the Garfield campaign when he ran for president. The problem, though, is that nobody really remembers Guiteau doing anything of significance to help get Garfield elected. But what they did notice about this guy is this guy clearly was weird. This guy seemed to be clearly unstable. And so when he came in basically demanding a high-profile diplomatic job like, ambassador to France or ambassador to Russia, he would throw out things like that. They pretty much just said, oh, okay, thank you, don't call us, we'll call you. And basically, he's rebuffed. Well, Guiteau is not going to take this rejection lying down. He is convinced that if Garfield is taken out of office, the next person that would be president, the current vice president, Chester A. Arthur, would realize his significance, Charles Guiteau, and would then award him with a proper federal job. So what does Guiteau do? Well, he finds President Garfield, along with the Secretary of State at the time, a guy named James Blaine, finds him in a train station in D.C. And this was back in the days before you had modern Secret Service protection or anything like that. The President of the United States could just simply walk down the street like any other citizen for the most part and would enter into the train station just like anybody else for the most part. Well, Guiteau finds Garfield in there and shoots him in the back. Garfield will die several weeks later in absolute agony. And Guiteau will exclaim that, that Arthur is now going to be president and that he was going to get his federal job. Of course, Garfield never gets his job. He goes off to jail. But it does send a very important message about the spoil system and the process by which federal jobs were being awarded. It was clearly showing that you cannot keep going in this way. It was too corrupt, it was too partisan, and now you've got a president that's been murdered because of it. So where do we go from here? Well, the man that will replace Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, will sign into law the Pendleton Act. Now, the Pendleton Act is a big deal. This is very important stuff. The Pendleton Act comes up a lot. The Pendleton Act is going to start to chip away at the spoil system tradition and create this thing called the Civil Service Commission. The idea being is that instead of using purely, partisan, ways to try to award federal bureaucratic jobs, that you would use more objective testing and experience and a more merit-based system for hiring people for these federal jobs. Now, note, the Pendleton Act is only going to be applying to about 10% of federal jobs at the time, But over the last several generations, we have seen the Civil Service Commission expand to the point where now today, approximately 90% of federal bureaucratic jobs are through the Civil Service Commission, which means today, if you want to get a job working for the Commerce Department or the EPA or the Post Office or whatever, you have to go to the Office of Personnel and Management and actually test for your job. The OPM takes these applicants and actually does the formal interviewing and testing to assign these federal jobs. And they're not allowed to ask you who you voted for. They're not allowed to ask you who you campaigned for because it does not matter. It's nonpartisan. It is based on merits and based on objective testing, not based on partisan affiliation. Now, note, that 90% is the bottom 90%. Your top 10% of bureaucrats, you're talking about the people that run your cabinet departments and run your independent executive agencies and deputies, ambassadors to someplace. All those top 10% positions are still political in nature. They're still appointed by the president. Most are confirmed, have to be confirmed by the Senate. And yes, every time there's a new president, all those top 10 positions are all removed and new people are brought in. But that bottom 90%, that stays in place regardless of who's president. And that creates a lot more stability, it creates a lot more honesty, and a lot more competence in our federal government. To round things out, keep in mind a couple other things. Pay in the federal bureaucracy is based on a rating system. In other words, you are paid not based on whether your manager likes you or not. It's based on things like service and education and, things like that, what your job responsibility is. So it's not like in the private sector where it's very secretive and, it's based on, how much your boss likes you and stuff like that. The other thing I wanted to make mention to get out of here real quick is something called the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act was passed in 1939 as an attempt to really wring out remaining political corruption amongst bureaucrats. Now, even though the civil service system was growing, there was still a culture in a lot of parts of the federal bureaucracy where people would actually use their jobs as a means to promote political campaigns. So, for example, it would be like, let's say that you were a postal worker and that you were on your route, and while you were on your route, you were out there campaigning for some candidate for office, wearing their hat or handing out, leaflets and mailers on behalf of that candidate. Well, that's corrupt. You're not supposed to be using your objective federal job to promote a specific political candidate. So what the Hatch Act does, and I like how it's called the Hatch Act because it's almost as if, Congress took a hatch or a hatchet almost to the political rights of federal bureaucrats. They basically said that, if you want to be a federal bureaucrat, fine, but you can no longer run for political office. You cannot donate money to a political campaign. In fact, you cannot campaign at all in any way, shape, or form, door to door, making phone calls, anything along those lines, if you're a federal bureaucrat. They really wanted to take out the political aspects of anything that could be corruptible within the rank and file of the federal bureaucracy. However, there's some issues with this. This is America, and we do have certain rights, and freedom of speech is part of that. So what we saw happening in 1993, there were a number of reforms that were put in place that tries to kind of draw more of a middle path between trying to take out political corruption in the federal bureaucracy and allowing people to express themselves politically per the First Amendment freedom of speech. So, for example, today, if you want to work for the post office, that's great. No, you cannot, while you're on your route, wear a Trump MAGA hat or be handing out leaflets in favor of Joe Biden while you're on your route. But when you clock out for the day, if you want to go and donate money to the Republican Party, you are more than happy to do so. If you want to go to a phone bank and make phone calls on behalf of candidates for the Democratic Party on your off hours, that is fine. But one thing they still say, though, is that you cannot run for elected office if you are a federal bureaucrat. So, anyhow, we're starting to run out of time here. Just be aware that we've kind of gone through this process of early competency-based jobs to a long era of corrupt spoil system jobs to now a very robust civil service process in place to have objective, competent federal bureaucrats with minimal corruption. All right? We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.